Shades, Chapter 12. When he reached Roswell, Max stopped at a convenience store a couple of blocks down from the Crashdown Cafe. Leaving the car, he crossed to the payphone mounted on the front of the liquor store. The sun beat down into the town, baking the pavement of the streets and parking areas and heating the air into a convection zone. He swiped his prepaid phone card through the phone's reader and punched in Isabel's cell phone number. Anxiously, he peered at the SUV with the news markings and the group of people standing in front of the Crashdown. Isabel answered on the fourth ring. What took you so long to answer the phone? Max asked. Max? Isabel responded. Yeah, I heard about the Crashdown, about the ghost. How did you know? Isabel asked. I've seen a few ghosts myself. Max didn't want to go into the whole story over the phone. Is Liz okay? I heard she was at the hospital. A hurried conversation on the street at a stoplight with a guy he knew from school had netted him this information. Liz is fine, Isabel answered. We need to talk. I know, Max agreed. I don't know for sure what happened at the Crashdown, but these ghosts are real. Maybe they're not ghosts, but they're something. I know. I've seen one myself. Where? Max demanded. Were you at the Crashdown? No, somewhere else, Isabel paused. We need to meet somewhere tonight, Max. We will. Where are you? The hospital. Are you all right? I'm fine. But she didn't sound fine, Max knew. He could hear the anxiety and uncertainty in his sister's voice. Those weren't qualities he usually attributed to Isabel Evans. Is Michael there? Max asked. No, he had been at the Crashdown, but Maria called a few minutes ago to say that he'd gone off with Valenti. Where did Michael and Valenti go? Maria didn't know. Frustration chafed at Max. He knew he needed to be doing something, but he didn't know what he was supposed to do. He told Isabel that he was on his way, then he hung up and climbed back into the Chevelle. So this guy was a uranium miner? Michael asked as Valenti pulled the truck to a stop in front of Leroy Wilkins' house. Valenti looked up at the three-story home. Yeah, one of the more successful desert rats who ever lived that kind of life. His dad was a miner before him. Taught Leroy everything he knew about mining. The elder Wilkins did a lot of mining for uranium used by the United States government during their nuclear weapons testing back in the 40s and 50s. There's an underground uranium mining museum over in Grants, New Mexico, that has some exhibits Leroy's father was responsible for. Michael studied the house. Trees had grown up around the house, closing in on the structure. Peeling paint looked like diseased areas. Shingles lay in the overgrown weeds in the yard and left bare spots on the roof. If the roof weren't leaking now, it soon would be. The railing around the porch had come loose in some areas and was rotting in others. Maintenance obviously wasn't part of the house's routine. This doesn't look like success, Michael commented. Valenti opened the truck door and got out. This is past success. Leroy Wilkins was one of the last wildcat miners, guys who bought up land rights and went hell for leather against the bedrock, hoping they found enough to earn them out of the investment. Michael watched a pair of hawks floating in lazy circles in the sky. Wilkins was successful enough to buy this property here and have this house built, Valenti continued. He threw a lot of parties back in his day. He was also a high-stakes gambler who spent a lot of time out in Vegas. He spent every dime he made, barely had enough to keep from losing the house to back taxes. Michael followed Valenti towards the front door. As you can tell, Valenti said as he stepped up onto the porch, Wilkins didn't make a lot of lasting friends in spite of the way he spent his money. Valenti's boots thudded across the uneven surface of the warped porch. You said he killed his partner, Michael pointed out. Maybe that had something to do with his lack of friends. Valenti tried the front door, but it was locked. I never said Wilkins killed his partner. I said Terrell Swanson disappeared. But he never managed the reappearance, did he? Michael asked sourly. No. Why would Wilkins kill his partner? Valenti peered through the windows. Because they found the strike that was as close to the mother lode as they'd ever found. Both of them had wills that gave their half of any mine to the surviving partner. Most of the business in those days was done between parties instead of corporations. Most of the business in those days done between partners instead of corporations operated like that. Strictly Old West rules. Boredom settled in over Michael. He leaned back against a section of the porch railing that looked like it would support his weight. Valenti glanced at him. Don't get too relaxed. You're supposed to be the lookout. If I see a ghost, Michael said, I'll scream. Yeah, Valenti said sarcastically. That works for me. He walked from the porch down to the two-car garage around the side of the house. The garage had been built into the hillside that provided the elevated foundation for the rest of the house. With the construction the way it was, the garage was on a split level beneath the house. Reluctantly, Michael followed Valenti. What are we doing here? Following up a lead. We have a lead? Michael asked. I must have missed the lead part. Swanson's ghost, Valenti said. That's a lead? Valenti halted in front of the garage door and looked at Michael. How did you see Swanson's ghost? Michael blinked, not fully comprehending. Valenti sighed. Okay, listen. Wilkins came into the crash down claiming a ghost no one else can see is chasing him. But you can see the ghost. And you can see the ghost of Tiller Osborne's dad. Why? Michael didn't say anything. They both knew what the only reason could be. So I'm wondering why Osborne's ghost came to the campsite and how much of a coincidence it is that Wilkins wandered into the crashdown today. Liz said her mother was talking to her dead grandmother this morning. Valenti narrowed his eyes. Liz didn't mention that when I talked to her at the hospital. Michael shrugged. It's not something she wants to talk about. Yeah, well, that still puts you at the eye of the storm, Valenti observed. Isabel saw a ghost too. Where? I don't know. What about Max? Michael shook his head. Haven't seen him since yesterday. Valenti blew out his breath. 3 ghosts that we know of then. Michael didn't say anything. The math was obvious. But out of those 3 ghosts, Valenti said, Wilkins' ghost is the only one we can investigate. Michael looked at the house. And the investigation is here? It starts here. Valenti pulled at the master lock on the garage door, then retreated to his truck and came back with a crowbar. Why here? Michael asked. Valenti set himself with the crowbar. Because Leroy Wilkins hardly ever leaves his house. He has his food delivered. He has his booze delivered. I'm curious about what drove him out of his house and into the crashdown. He swung the crowbar, connecting with the master lock and tearing the mechanism from the garage door and frame. I think that's called forcible entry, Michael said. Not exactly the letter of the law. I'm not exactly the law these days, Valenti said. Michael couldn't miss the trace of bitterness in the man's voice. Give me a hand, Valenti said, squatting to shove the end of the crowbar under the garage door. He got into position and heaved up. The heavy wooden door rose a little with a prolonged creak. Michael knelt down and slid his fingers under the garage door. For just a moment, the image of something strange and horrifying waiting in the darkness on the other side of the door flooded his mind. Then he leaned his shoulder into the garage door and lifted. The garage door rose, creaking and shrieking along the rusty tracks. An explosion of musty air twisted around Michael, clogging his nostrils with the stink and freezing his breath in his lungs for a moment. It was hard not to think of raising the garage door as opening a crypt. The garage housed an ancient Willis Jeep that had originally started out olive drab green, but had been painted orange at some point. The change in color hadn't taken well because huge patches of green showed where the orange paint had peeled away. Shelves lined the wall opposite the basement door and the back of the garage, filled with prospecting equipment and ore samples. Valenti started to step into the garage with the harsh, blatting noise of a 2-cycle motorcycle engine, blared to life, approaching quickly. Certain that the garage door was firmly lodged into place, Michael turned loose the hold he had on it and looked back out into the yard. A dust-spattered yellow dirt bike roared into the yard and halted 30 feet away. The rider was thin and looked too small to handle the motorcycle. The helmet masked the features, gloves covered the hands, and a black riding suit clothed the rider. You see it too? Valenti asked. Yeah, Michael said. It's not a ghost. How sure are you? Really sure, Michael replied. When one of the ghosts arrives, there's this static electricity buildup I told you about. Not a ghost, Valenti repeated. That's good. It also means, Michael said, that we've been caught trespassing. He glanced at the raised garage door and the crowbar in Valenti's hands, and breaking and entering. Max stopped at the doorway to the hospital emergency room waiting area and stared at Liz. She was so near physically, but as he watched her looking out the window, he realized that she seemed almost a million miles away. Then, as if sensing him there, Liz turned and looked at him. Max met her gaze and felt the same electricity that he'd always felt when she looked at him. Tess had never taken those feelings away, only muted them and confused him for a time, blinding him through his weakness of needing to know more about his true home. Max crossed to Liz, barely cognizant of the other people in the room. Stopping in front of Liz, Max said, I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay? I'm fine, she answered. Max nodded, searching desperately for something else to say. Is your dad okay? I heard he was here too. Liz nodded towards the other end of the room. Mr. Parker stood with a cell phone clutched to his ear. Nothing happened to anybody at the cafe, Liz said. Then she explained about Wilkins and the ghost that Michael had seen. I heard Michael was with Valenti. Michael said, trying to head off of the uncomfortable silence he was certain was going to occur. Do you know why?
Liz shook her head. I think he wanted to check on the ghosts Michael and Wilkins saw. His name was Terrell Swanson, and he disappeared 30 years ago. Valenti's dad was trying to find him because he believed Wilkins killed him. So the ghost is real, Max thought, back to the phantom warrior he'd seen with Riverdog. Riverdog had never met his ancestor, but Henry Callancrow had been known to several of the Mesalico tribe. Max, Liz said softly, ghosts aren't real. They can't be real. Ghost he'd seen 2 years ago. He let the man die after giving his life to save his daughter. For days afterward, the man had haunted Max, until Max and Michael had broken into the hospital so Max could heal all the children there. That was different, Liz said softly. She touched his cheek with her hand. Max looked at her, amazed at how well she could sometimes just know what he was thinking. If they could communicate on things so disjointed as this, why couldn't she know how much he loved her? She does know how much I love her, Max realised. She just can't trust that love. Not after Tess. Meh. You don't even know if he was a ghost, Liz said. Max knew that was true. He'd never truly discovered if the ghost that was supernatural or inspired by his own feelings of guilt at watching the man die. These things are real, Max stated. Liz's eyes widened. You've seen one too. Max told her about the ghosts on the Mesalico reservation. What were you doing out there, Liz asked. Max knew that she already guessed. She drew back from him, taking her hand away from the side of his face and moving back in her chair. Although they were only a few inches apart, the distance felt like a huge gulf. Looking for a way to find my son, Max answered. She knew, and she'd know if he tried to lie about it. Even though he was only trying to spare her feelings, she'd know that too, and she wouldn't like it. Pain fled through Liz's eyes. Did you? No. I'm sorry. Max nodded. That doesn't mean I'm going to give up trying. Liz remained silent. I just wanted you to know that, Max said, just so we can keep being honest. Her voice was softer when she spoke. I already knew that, Max. I wouldn't expect any less of you, but that doesn't make things any easier between us. I know, Max whispered, and that knowledge felt like it was going to kill him. Isabel stood at the front of the hospital and watched Jesse drive away. He waved, and as he pulled out onto the street, it felt like a piece of her was leaving too. She'd had that feeling every time she'd had to step away from him, and the desolation of being left alone got harder and harder to face. She was afraid that facing the emptiness after Jesse left would one day be too much for her, and she wouldn't be able to let go. And what would she do then? Isabel had no idea, and that both frustrated and scared her. She'd always kept her life and her relationships neatly organised. School and home lives had been kept in neat little packages. She even had a special box for Christmas that only came out during those holidays. The secret to her life had been in keeping these boxes separate within herself. That way there was no internal conflicts. On most days, Max seemed like he'd been born with internal conflicts. Getting involved with Liz Parker had only put an edge on those conflicts and given them a central point to revolve around. Love was hard on him. On the other hand, Michael had a nature destined for hardship and confrontation. Looking at him, Isabel thought most people would think love wouldn't be a problem for Michael because he'd beaten that emotion into whatever shape he wanted. Only his relationship with Maria wasn't working out that way either. Max was one of the most caring and understanding guys Isabel had ever seen, though she probably wouldn't tell him that. And Michael was one of the most thoughtless and self-absorbed people she knew, and she had told him that, more or less, upon occasion. To a degree, Max and Michael were extremes when it came to relationship issues, yet neither one of them could maintain relationships with people they truly cared about without a lot of heartache involved. Isabel walked into the hospital and made her way to the ER waiting area. She halted at the door when she saw Max and Liz sitting together. She didn't want to intrude. Max and Liz sat only inches apart, but they didn't touch. The silence and stillness that kept them apart might as well have been a steel barricade, Isabel thought. For the first time, she understood the pain that her brother was going through. To be so close, and yet so apart. Kyle sat on the side of the hospital bed in the hospital emergency room. His arm throbbed with pain as the doctor examined the long laceration on his forearm. We got really lucky here, Dr. Bohr said, gently prying at the flesh around the cut. How do you figure? Kyle asked. He didn't feel especially lucky. He also didn't look at the wound because of the bloody mess reminded him much of the ghost or hallucination he'd seen back at the work site. It's a big wound, Dr. Bohr said, and deep, but you didn't nick any tendons. A few stitches, Kyle said, looking at the doctor. The doctor was young, not yet 30, and he wore a Remy Zero, somebody save me, concert t-shirt under the pale blue scrubs. He peered at Kyle through rimless glasses and smiled a little. Stitches, he repeated. We can call them sutures if you'd like. How about we call them band-aids? I can just take this together, the doctor said. I'll have a nurse prep you and we'll get that arm numbed. Then I'll put in about 8 stitches will do it, I think. Sure, Kyle grumbled, taking his arm back from the doctor. Gently, he folded his arm across his chest, trapping the limb with his other arm across his wrist. He tried to remember the last time he'd gotten stitches. Want me to let your dad know you're okay? Dr. Bohr asked. My dad, Kyle asked. Is he here? A confused expression settled on Dr. Ball's face. I thought that the gentleman who brought you in. He's not my dad, Kyle said, surprised at the resentment that filled him. He's my boss. Oh, Dr. Ball said. My mistake. I'll see you in a little while. Sure, Kyle said. As Dr. Ball passed through the curtain section that marked the entrance of the emergency room area, Quinlan stuck his head around. Could you use some company, kid? After as long as I've been here, Kyle said, I'm surprised that you're still here. Quinlan walked over to the bed and shrugged. I brought you here. I wanted to make sure you may get feeling in your stomach. You haven't been able to reach my dad, have you? Quinlan shook his head. I left a message on the answering machine at your house. Moving gingerly, still aware of the pain throbbing in his injured arm, Kyle lay back on the bed, settling in for the long haul. He tried to not let any of the unhappiness he felt at his dad's absence show. Figures, Kyle thought sourly. Any other day of the week, Dad would be home with a can of beer in one hand and watching ESPN. Some of the resentment he was starting to feel about the elder Valenti's lack of interest in finding a job made his stomach roll. He felt his increased heartbeat thump at his temples. You okay? Quinlan asked. Yeah, Kyle said, just the arm. Looks nasty. Doc said it's not as bad as it looks. Quinlan nodded. That's good. I don't want your dad upset with me. This isn't your fault. Did the doc say how long you're going to be dealing with a busted wing? Quinlan asked. When I get out of here, Kyle said, I'll be ready to get back to work. Quinlan laughed and scratched his head. You got sand, kid. I'm sure give you that. But once they get through working on that arm, you may be surprised at how much it hurts. I'll get someone to cover you for the next couple of days. I don't want to take any days off, Kyle said. I can't afford to. The bills are piling up at the house, and Dad isn't even looking at them anymore. Kyle knew he shouldn't be mad at his dad. His dad had been through hell lately because of Max, Michael, Isabel, and Tess. The sheriff's job had disappeared because of his involvement with the Roswell aliens. And maybe his dad had lost some of his spirit when he discovered how evil Tess had been. Alex's parents still didn't know what had happened to him, and Kyle knew his dad had to sit on that knowledge too. We'll take a couple of days off, Quinlan said, at least. Then we'll see how it goes. Kyle knew he should be thankful he had such an understanding boss, but all he could think of was getting a short check. If I can, I need to make up the time. What time? Quinlan said. You were hurt on the job, kid. Me and the insurance will take care of you. The information made Kyle feel a little better. He lay back on the pillows and tried to relax. He also tried not to think about where his dad was. Just as the pain in his arm seemed to die down, he heard someone screaming from the area behind the curtain on his left.
Okay, we are on to chapter 13. Michael stared at the helmeted motorcycle rider. Judging from the rider's size against the machine, the rider was a kid. Valenti stepped forward and dropped the crowbar down against his leg so the tool wasn't so prominent. Hey, he called, waving a hand, this isn't what it looks like. The motorcycle helmet shifted, going back and forth between Michael and Valenti a few times. Then the rider reached down and switched off the two-cycle engine. Reaching up, the rider took off the helmet and shook out her ponytail. She gazed at Michael. Sunlight gave her chestnut hair a reddish gleam and made the spray of freckles across her nose and cheeks stand out. Her braces gleamed silver. If I didn't know you, Sheriff Valenti, the girl said, I'd hightail it back home and call 911. Valenti showed her an easy smile. I'm glad that you didn't, Kelly. However, Kelly said, I also know that you're not the sheriff of Roswell anymore, and I'm guessing that you used the crowbar to break into Mr. Wilkins' garage. So I want an explanation of what you and the hunk are doing here. Valenti looked at Michael. Hunk? Michael thought, feeling more than a little embarrassed. The girl was maybe 12 years old and acting way beyond her years. There's been an accident in town, Valenti said, looking back at the girl. Mr. Wilkins had a heart attack, Kelly said. I saw it on the news just after lunch. The local news team interrupted the baseball game. Then they kept interrupting so much I figured I'd go for a ride and catch the box scores later. The game was a blowout anyway, she paused. That doesn't explain what you're doing down here. Sharp kid, Michael couldn't help thinking, and obnoxious. I came down to check on Wilkins' house, Valenti said. I know he used to keep cocktails. It looks like Wilkins' stay in the hospital is going to be a while. I know that he doesn't have any family that he can call to take care of the birds. Kelly pushed the motorcycle's kickstand down, then leaned the dirt bike over while she hopped off. I can help, she offered, trudging towards them. Help, Valenti repeated, and Michael could tell from Valenti's tone that that was the last thing he wanted. Sure, Kelly said. Mr. Wilkins sometimes hires me to do house cleaning and take care of the birds. I didn't know that, Valenti admitted. Helping Mr. Wilkins is how I earn the money for the motorcycle, Kelly said. I'm surprised that you remembered the birds. I was on my way down here to take care of them. You got a key to the house? Michael asked. Kelly rolled her eyes at him. There's other ways to get into places than keys. She glanced at the crowbar along Valenti's leg. Or crowbars. I'm not used to breaking into places, Valenti said. Usually I've been around to prevent that. Well, the girl said, you stink at it, but you did get the job done. Thanks, Valenti said, I think. Kelly stopped just inside the garage where the darkness started. Did you or the hunk think to bring a flashlight? I've got one in the trunk. It's okay, Kelly said. We can use mine. She reached into her jacket and brought out a small halogen flash. Michael was impressed, but didn't let it show on his face. Do you see Wilkins on a daily basis? Valenti asked as they filed by the orange and green spotted Willis Jeep. More like 3 times a week, Kelly answered. Mr. Wilkins doesn't have as much money as a lot of people around here think. Yeah, Valenti said. I knew that. The girl shone the flashlight over the boxes of one sample in tools at the back of the garage. Mr. Wilkins still went prospecting from time to time. I guess you knew that. Yeah, Valenti said. Sometimes I'd catch him out in the desert on that 3-wheeler he used to ride, and sometimes in the Jeep, and I'd check on him, make sure he had enough water and wasn't getting overheated. Mr. Wilkins could always take care of himself in the desert, Kelly said. It was people he didn't trust himself around. He didn't like going into town. He came into town today, Michael said. He glanced through the boxes and boxes of rock chunks and soil samples, not seeing at all why someone would be interested in them. They looked all the same to him. Wilkins went into Roswell occasionally, Valenti said. Yeah, Kelly turned toward the house side of the garage. The flashlight beam tracked across the wall, revealing 2 doors next to each other. Was today one of the scheduled days? No, Kelly replied. Are you sure? Valenti asked. Yeah. Mr. Wilkins always had me watch his house while he was gone. I was one of the few people he trusted. During school session, he'd wait till I was home before he'd go into Roswell. Then Wilkins either went to Roswell to see someone, Michael said, or something chased him out of here. Kelly swung on him, shining the light in his eyes and causing him to raise a hand in defense. Sorry, she said. Don't you work at the crash down? Yeah, Michael answered. I do that when I'm not helping Valenti burgle the houses of old rich people. Kelly grinned and laughed. I knew you weren't here about the birds. Valenti looked uncomfortable. No, that was our cover story. So what's the real reason? Kelly asked. Wilkins told people at the crash down that he was being chased by a ghost, Valenti said. Is that what he told you, Brown Eyes? Kelly asked Michael. He didn't tell me, Michael replied. He told a friend of mine. I was standing there when he did. Kelly's face wrinkled. Did he say who the ghost belonged to? No, Valenti said. Swanson, Michael said, ignoring the glare he got from Valenti. The news didn't say anything about that, Kelly said. It's protected information, Valenti said. Kelly's eyebrows raised in understanding. You mean, in case it turns out someone was trying to scare Mr. Wilkins out of his house and steal his stuff? Actually, Michael hadn't been thinking that far ahead, but the conclusion sounded logical to him and would give them the leverage they needed to keep asking questions. Yeah, Michael said. That still doesn't explain what an ex-sheriff and a short order cook from the crash down is doing here investigating, Kelly observed. The new sheriff is interested in chasing down ghost stories, Valenti said. And you are? Kelly shot him a doubtful look. He's tired of Oprah and Montel, Michael said. What about you? Kelly asked. Do you think I want to be a short order cook all my life? And you're not going to be a short order cook. How? Michael smiled at her. Professional Ghostbuster. Kelly smiled. Cool. Valenti grimaced, and Michael figured Valenti wasn't totally enthusiastic about the new cover story. Has Wilkins acted any differently lately? Valenti asked. Mr. Wilkins has always acted different, Kelly said. She gestured with the flashlight beam towards the ore samples. I mean, how many people keep boxes of rocks like this? Michael figured the girl had a point. Nodding to the 2 doors, Valenti asked, where do these doors go? Turning her light to the doors, Kelly said, the door on the left goes upstairs to the house, but the door on the right goes to the workroom. What's in the workroom? Valenti asked. I don't know. Mr. Wilkins never let me in there. You never let yourself in there? Michael asked. I mean, you said you don't need a key to get into places. Kelly rolled her eyes at Michael in pure disgust. The effort was worthy of something Maria could deliver. Michael figured the ability must be a gender thing. No, Kelly said. I respected his privacy. Valenti stepped towards the door. Somebody didn't. The lock's off the door. He knelt and picked up a padlock from the garage floor. Let me see that light. Kelly stepped closer and handed the flashlight over. Lifting the padlock, Valenti shone the flashlight beam over the mechanism. Doesn't appear to have been forced. Maybe Wilkins forgot to lock it behind him, Michael suggested. Mr. Wilkins never forgot something like that, Kelly said. Whatever was in the workroom was important. Was? Michael asked. If the door is open, Kelly said with major exasperation. You can bet that whatever was in there is gone now. We'll see, Valenti said. He kept the flashlight and took a fresh grip on the crowbar. Then he glanced at Michael. Keep her safe. Michael nodded, catching the young girl by the elbow and pulling her back. She fought against him, but he kept her moving forward towards the garage opening, not stopping till she was behind the Willis Jeep. What do you think you're doing? Kelly protested. She balled up her fists and shoved them into Michael's chest. Calm down, Michael told her, grabbing her wrist so she couldn't hurt him. You can't just take my flashlight, Kelly yelled. Terrific, Michael thought. I could have saved the crash down for this. He glanced over his shoulder and watched as Valenti entered the workroom. The flashlight cut through the darkness. Hey, Michael called. You want to go ahead and blow the all clear before I get my brains beaten in? The light stayed in one spot for a time, then Valenti turned back towards the open doorway. You got to see this to believe it. Before Michael could respond, he sensed the buildup of static electricity charging the air. A savage wind whipped out of nowhere, amping up the atmospheric disturbance. Dust and grit whirled up from the garage's paved floor and stung his eyes. Kelly screamed, no longer intent on freeing herself. She reached for Michael, grabbing his shirt and pulling herself into him. Through the blinding haze, Michael saw the monstrous shape rise in the basement space behind Valenti. Liz, drawn from the confused tangle of dreams and pain that her thoughts seemed to consist primarily of these days, Liz looked up and saw her dad standing before her. Yeah, Dad? Jeff Parker looked worn out. Tourist season was always hard and demanded a lot of the whole family. Why don't you go back to the crash down? The sheriff tells me he's not going to need to do any more questioning. Is there anything Mom needs? Liz pushed up from the chair. Her dad sighed and ran a hand through his hair. If there is, I didn't even think to ask. It's okay, Liz said. I'll ask, then tell her you told me to. Her dad smiled. I appreciate that, Liz. No problem, Liz said. She was looking forward to being out of the hospital. Are you going to be okay? I'll be fine, her father assured her. Tell your mom I'll be home soon. Liz nodded, glancing across the waiting area, and saw Isabel and Max locked in a heavy conversation on the other side of the doorway that led to the vending machines. After Isabel had arrived a few minutes ago, she'd taken Max away to talk privately. Maybe some of the reason was because Max and Isabel didn't want to risk being overheard by Jeff Parker. But Liz was certain that part of the reason for the relocation was because Isabel and Max were trying to cut her out of their affairs. Okay, Liz thought, maybe I'm being a little paranoid here. And didn't I just give Max the cold shoulder to a degree? I wasn't overly responsive to his attempts at conversation. She tried. She really had. But she just kept seeing Tess in her mind, kept hearing Tess's voice, and there were the images of Tess and Max together. She'd seen them together around school, but she'd never seen them intimate together. That didn't stop her mind from creating the images, though. Jeff Parker's cell phone rang. He waved a final goodbye and scooped the phone from his pocket. A moment of indecision froze Liz. Wave goodbye or just go? She didn't know what was more acceptable with whatever relationship was left between them. Then Max turned and glanced at her as if sensing she was about to leave. She gazed into his dark eyes, feeling herself drawn to him. Resisting the impulse to walk over to him, she waved and pointed towards the main entrance that led outside to the parking area. Max checked his conversation with Isabel and came back to Liz. What's going on? He asked. All done here, Liz replied. Dad says I can go back to the crash down and see what needs doing there. Max hesitated a moment, and his discomfort was plain. I've got my car outside. I can give you a lift. It's only a few blocks, Liz replied, not wanting to interrupt the conversation between siblings that obviously wasn't meant for her. She felt a little guilt over the anger that beat through her. I don't mind, Max said. I like the company. Uncertainty threaded through Liz. God, why does this have to be so hard? Either I want to be with him or I don't. But it wasn't that simple, even though she wanted it to be. In words, she knew the decision to be around Max in whatever capacity was never going to be simple or easy again. Liz wanted to say no. She didn't need any more complications in her life. But then she realized that maybe her mom was talking to the ghost of her dead grandmother, and the pod squad were the only ones who could see the ghosts. Instead, she said, okay, and the answer wasn't as solid or convincing as either of them would have wanted. Max opened the front doors, and the blast of furnace heat of Roswell on a June afternoon rolled into the emergency room waiting area. Before they could go outside, a hoarse scream ripped through the waiting area. That came from the back, Liz said. The scream was repeated, drawing the attention of everyone in the building. The nurses at the front desk abandoned their posts and rushed to the back. Keep him away from me, a man's hoarse voice screamed. Oh, God, keep him away from me. He's dead. He's dead. Max started back into the hospital. Liz followed at his heels. "Somebody help me," a different male voice roared. Liz recognized the voice at once. She never broke stride, running a step behind Max. "That's Kyle," she said. "I know," Max replied. He rushed through the swinging doors that led to the care center. Liz had been to the emergency room center before and recognized the room instantly. Beds lined both sides of the large, long room and were given the illusion of isolation by the pale blue curtains hanging from tracked runners on the ceiling. Kyle, one arm bare and bloody where his shirt sleeve had been cut away, held an old man in the bed next to his. The man looked like he was at least 70, pale and wizened. Plastic tubing ran from IVs in both arms to bags hanging on either side of the bed. "Get him away from me," the old man roared. "He's dead. He's come after me," he screamed in fear. Kyle's wounded arm bled over the old man's sheets as he struggled to keep the guy down on the bed. "Somebody help me." Nurses and 2 doctors in scrubs ran over to the old man's bed. Then an electrical strike strobed the floor and the lights in the emergency room went out. All right, and that's chapter 13.